This is the first game from Prep Test 53. This is a basic grouping game where we have T, W, X, Y, and Z as our variables in three groups, F, P, and S. The variables, each one of them just goes into one group, and we're told in our scenario that each group, F, P, and S, gets at least one of the variables. So I visually represented that by putting a slot into each group just so we don't forget. So let's take a look at our rules. Our first rule says that X is in group F. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to write that to the side. X is in group F. And I'm also going to put X directly in to group F. Pretty easy rule. Our next rule says X and Y do not sign together. So they're not going to be in the same group, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to put down here that X and Y are never going to be together. We can easily just see what that means, right? Because we already know where X is. So Y is not going to be allowed into group F, and we're going to write that down. So we're also going to want to write that to the side of our rule here and put that down as an inference that Y cannot be in group F. And now one thing we should cover here is that this rule could be written in two different ways. We could have written this as if X is in a group, then Y is not in that group. And of course the contrapositive being if Y is in a group, then X is not in that group. But in a game like this, I prefer to write it as the box with a slash through it, just because that's easier to work with. It's just more visually representative of what we're dealing with in this game. Our next rule says that Z is in the same group as Y. Z and Y will be together. Y is coming up a lot here. So we're going to put them in a box together. And of course, this means that Z also cannot be in group F. Z is also out of this group. So that's another inference we can make, and I'm going to put that right next to our rule here about Y, that Z also cannot be in F. Of course, that means that ZY has to be in either P or S, because every single one of our variables, we're told, has to go in at least one of these groups. It's not going to be F, so we can already kind of see that Z and Y, notice that's 40% of our variables, Z and Y here, are bound to one of two groups. So that's important to take note of. Our next rule, our last rule, says that if T is in group S, then W is also in group S. Of course, the contrapositive of this being that if W is not in S, then T is not in S. So if we find out later on that W is here in S, then what do we mean? We know that T also has to be here in that group. On the other hand, if we find out that, say, T is in group F, in that case, we know that W cannot be in this group. So we can see those are the ways that rule would come up. Now, what's interesting is that we have to have at least one in each of these groups. We can kind of just already see that Z and Y, right? Let's say we put Z and Y into group P, right, which is one of the two scenarios. How would that play out? Well, now we know that either T or W has to be in S. One of them's gonna have to go here. And since we know that if W is not in S, then T can't be either, then we know for a fact that W will have to be in S in that scenario. So that's one inference we could make. It's a lot easier to see if we just split up our board, which is what I'm going to suggest we do. We split this game up into two separate diagrams. And what we're going to do is for our first diagram, we're just going to put Z and Y into P, and that's our first world here. And then for our second one, we're going to put Z and Y into S. And this is useful for two reasons. One is that this represents all possible situations here, right? Z and Y can only be in either P or S, right? Because it can't be in F. And now we can actually get rid of this pesky ZY not on top and make this just a lot easier to work out, a lot cleaner. We don't need that because we know where Z and Y are. They're in either P or S depending on which world we're in. Secondly, we can go ahead and make inferences based on the position of Z and Y, and we can solve for both of these possibilities. And this is great because we already have a 60%, 3 of 5 variables taken care of here in both these situations. So let's look at our top one where we have Z and Y on P. In that situation, like I was saying, that somebody's got to go into S, right? Somebody has to go here. And the only people we have left are T and W. These are our only contenders for going into S. So what would happen? Like, let's just say hypothetically, if I put a W into F, what would happen in that scenario? Well, according to our contrapositive here of our last rule, if W is not in S, which this would qualify, then T can't be in S either, which means no one would end up in S. Well, that is just not allowed. We just cannot have that scenario because we're told in our scenario that somebody has to go there. Somebody has to go in each of these groups. The same thing, of course, would happen if W is in P. Then W is not in S, and then T would have to not be in S either. The takeaway from this is that W has to go in S in this world. Now, T, who knows? Maybe T's in S, maybe T's in P, maybe T's in F. We just don't know because this rule now has been taken care of. We don't get to use it anymore for this top world. Because regardless, W in S does not imply that T has to be in S, right? It's the other way around. So all we're left with up here is T, right? And we don't know where T is going to be, but it's just kind of floating. It's a wild card variable, but that's pretty good. We've solved 4 of 5 pieces, and T can just go in any of the spots. Down here in our bottom world, it's like, okay, well, who's left over? Still T and W. One of them, of course, is going to have to go into P. We do know that either T or W is going to go here. So that's like one of the two of them is going to end up here. We just don't know which. One thing we can know, though, is that if T ends up in S, well, what happens in that scenario? What happens if we put T into S? Well, then W is going to have to go into S as well. And then neither one of them is going to end up in P. And that's just not something that we can deal with in this scenario. So what we have to say is that, hey, T can't end up in S. Because if it did, if T was here, we'd end up in a situation where W would also have to be in S. So what we're going to do is we're going to say that T and W are still floating. One of them is going to have to go here into P, and T cannot go into S. And those are the rules for our second world. So question 1. Question 1 is just an acceptability question, where we're asked, what could be a possible list of the variables and groups. So of course we handle that by just going rule by rule and eliminating answer choices that violate with those rules. X has to be in F. And immediately we can see that D violates that rule. X is not in F, so D is out of here. Our second rule is that X and Y have to be together. So we can easily just look for Y in F. If we see Y in F, we know that we can cross something out. And that allows us to cross out E. Z and Y together. That's another thing we have to see. And that allows us to cross out answer C. And if T is in S, then W also has to be in S. And now we only have 2 answers to look through. And it turns out that in answer A, we see T in S, but we do not see W. So A is out and B is our answer. Question number 2 said which of the following could be true. This is a global question, right? We're not given a specific scenario. So let's just take a look at our answers. A says W is the only one in S, that W is the only one in S. And we can actually see just in our first group here that, yeah, that's entirely possible. T could either go in F or P in this first world, so that is absolutely possible. That is our answer here. On test day, I would say circle it, move on. All right, if you're taking a timed test, you know that's the case. Just go ahead and move forward to question number 3. But for now, let's go ahead and go through the other answers to see why they're wrong. B says W, Y, and Z are all in P. And we can see here that doesn't work for our first world. W has to be in S for this one, so that's not true. Down here, W can be in P, but now Z and Y have to be in S. So that's just not allowed. Answer C says X is with Z. Well, actually no, because remember, X and Y can't be together, but Z and Y do have to be together. So X and Y will never be in the same group, and we can see that represented visually in our 2 scenarios. D says that Z is the only one in S. Well, under no scenario can that happen because Z has to be with Y, so that's just very obvious. And E, 3 are in F. 3 are in F. Well, it looks tempting because down here it looks like, oh, maybe we can have that with X, T, and W, but we have to remember that one of them has to go here in P. Right, either T or W, one of the 2 of them is gonna be here in group P. So we can have a maximum of 1 of either T or W here in F, max. And so answer E is just not allowed. Question number 3 is another global question, but this time we're looking for what must be true. Let's take a look. A says W and Z are not together, right? So we're saying that W and Z cannot be together. Well, that's just not true, right? Because W could be here in our second world. We could see W and Z together. B says that F has 2 max, that it can't have 3. Well, actually, yeah, that's true. All right, let's look at both worlds. For our first one, we have T could go here, but that maxes it out, right? We can't have like X with 2 more. So F can have maximum 2 in this one. And what about down here, right? What about our second world? Well, again, we can only have one of either T or W that goes with F, which maxes out at 2. So yeah, it turns out that B is our answer. Question number 4 asks us to determine which one would solve everything. So which answer, if true, would allow us to just solve everything altogether? So let's go through our answer choices. A says that T is on F. So A is saying, hey, what happens if we put T into F? Will that solve everything? And we know that's not true because T and F could happen in either one of these two worlds that we've established, either one of our diagrams. And if we can't even narrow down which world we're looking at, we certainly can't solve the whole thing and know where everything is going to be. So A is out. B says T is on S. Okay, well, that can't happen down here. We know that T cannot be on S, so this world is out. What about up here at top? Well, T can be in S, right? So we're allowed to figure out that it's only this world, and that would solve this world, right? Because there's nothing else to place, which means that T being on S is our answer, right? That allows us to place all the other variables on the board. And that's very obvious to us when we look at it for these two worlds. So you might be saying like, okay, so what if I didn't know in advance to split this up into two worlds, to put Z and Y here in P and ZY here in S? Would I still be able to answer this question and do it efficiently? And yes, you could. Certainly having it in two worlds helps. But if you hadn't thought to do that, this is still something that you can work with. And let's take a look at how. Okay, so we're putting T into S. That's what answer B tells us. Well, all right, well, T's in S, and W also has to be in S. Well, now what? Well, now we have Z and Y remaining. Well, somebody has to go here in P. Well, it's going to have to be either Z or Y, but either Z or Y, they both bring along the other, right? They're a block. They're a group. So Z and Y are forced into P, and that is all of our variables. So even if we hadn't split this up, this is still a very doable. And question number 5, if Z is in S, if we put Z into S, then which of the following must be false? So it must be false or cannot be true, same thing. So we're putting Z into S. Well, Z is in P here, right? So this has to be down here that we're talking about where we already have Z into S. We want to know what cannot be true. Well, I'll tell you what I immediately look for is T and S, right? We already solved that up front, and it turns out that is answer C. Just right off the bat, we're able to see that because we made the difference in advance. Well, once again, let's take a look at how to solve this had we not decided to split this up into two diagrams. How would we have dealt with? And okay, so here's what we'd have done, right? It says Z is on S. All right. Well, Z's on S, well, Y has to be here too, right? According to our rule. Well, somebody has to go into P, right? So either T or W is going to go into P, right? And so it's like, okay, well, one of them has to go here, which means that T can't go into S, right? Because if T did go into S, then it would drag W with it, right? If we put T here, oh, this rule triggers, W is in S as well. That can't happen, which means T cannot be in S, and that would have given us answer C.